My adopted daughter said, "If you vanished tomorrow, no one would care," at her party. I said nothing. The next morning, her mother found the black backpack. She read the first page of the letter inside, dropped it, and whispered, "Oh God, call him right now." I had been in that house for 18 years, not as a guest, not as a backup, not as a temporary arrangement that outlasted its usefulness, as the man who showed up before anyone else and left after everyone stopped noticing. I want you to understand what that means before we go any further, because the number of people who will hear this story and immediately reach for the word overreaction is exactly the number of people who have never quietly carried a family on their back, while that family looked through them like a window. I was 31 years old when I married Carol. She had a daughter named Sienna who was 4 years old and who looked at me with enormous brown eyes on the day we met and asked if I knew how to make pancakes. I told her I did not, but that I was willing to learn. She considered this for approximately 3 seconds and then took my hand and led me to the kitchen. I stood at that stove for an hour making increasingly terrible pancakes while she supervised from a step stool. And by the time we were done, there was batter on the ceiling and she was laughing so hard she could barely breathe. I drove home that night knowing I was going to adopt that child. I did not say it out loud for another 4 months, but I knew. I knew the way you know a thing that has already been decided somewhere deeper than your thinking mind. I finalized the adoption 14 months after the wedding. I signed every form, paid every legal fee, attended every required meeting, and stood in a courtroom on a Tuesday morning while a judge said Sienna's last name out loud for the first time as mine. She was 5 years old and wearing a yellow dress, and she cried when the judge smiled at her, and I cried too, and Carol took a photograph of the two of us holding hands on the courthouse steps that used to live in a frame on the hallway wall. I do not know if that photograph is still there. I have not been back to check. What happened over the next 13 years is a story told in receipts and mileage and unreturned thank yous. I paid the mortgage on overtime shifts when Carol was between jobs for 11 months. I drove Sienna to volleyball practice 4 days a week for 3 years, sitting in parking lots with a book and a gas station coffee, waiting. I stayed up through the fevers that spiked at 2 in the morning and the meltdowns before standardized tests, and the night she was 15 and called me from a party crying, and I drove 40 minutes in the rain without asking a single question until she was in the car and safe. I wrote checks totaling well over $400,000 into that family over the course of our marriage. I seeded a college fund with $38,000 of my own savings, money I had set aside before the marriage, money that represented years of careful discipline and deliberate sacrifice. I did these things not because I expected a parade. I did them because I had decided that Sienna was my daughter and Carol was my wife, and that the measure of a man is what he does when nobody is watching. But something had been shifting for a long time, slowly enough that I kept explaining it away. Carol had grown distant in a way that felt less like a season and more like a permanent change in weather. She forgot to mention things to me. She made decisions about the household and the finances and Sienna's life without consulting me. Not in a hostile way, but in a way that suggested the thought of consulting me simply did not occur to her. And Sienna, who had once taken my hand and led me to a kitchen to make pancakes, had by her mid-teens started treating me with a particular brand of cheerful indifference that I can only describe as the way you treat a piece of furniture you have stopped seeing. Not cruelty, just absence, the absence of recognition. I told myself it was a phase. I told myself she was a teenager, and teenagers pull away. I told myself 100 things while I kept signing forms and writing checks and driving miles and fixing latches and sanding banisters and marking her height in pencil on the doorway every birthday from age 4 to 14, a ritual she had stopped wanting at 15, but that I had kept photographing anyway because I thought one day she would want the record of it. The party was my idea. $3,200 in a single weekend. Catered food, a rented tent in the backyard because the forecast looked uncertain, custom banners with photographs from every year of her life, including the courthouse photograph, including the step stool in the kitchen, including every milestone I had documented because I believed that the visible evidence of love was itself a form of love. I ordered a cake from the bakery she had mentioned in passing 6 weeks earlier, a bakery I had written down in my phone because I pay attention to passing mentions. I drove 40 minutes to pick it up myself on the morning of the party. I was standing near the buffet table at approximately 6:45 in the evening, holding a paper plate with a slice of that cake on it, when I heard her voice carry across the room. She was leaning toward her friend, a girl named Bree who I had driven to volleyball tournaments on at least a dozen occasions. They were standing close together, glasses raised, and Sienna's voice had that particular pitch of a person performing something for an audience of one, the tone of a person who wants to be heard without being confronted. If he vanished tomorrow, she said, no one would care. They clinked their glasses together and laughed. The room did not go quiet. The music kept playing. Other conversations kept moving. My wife was across the room looking at something on her phone, her shoulders shaking with whatever she was reading, unbothered and unreachable. Nobody turned their head. Nobody saw my face do whatever it did in that moment. I set the plate on the buffet. I wiped my fingers on a napkin slowly and deliberately, the way you do when you need your hands to have something to do. And then I walked out to the back porch alone, and stood in the cold night air and looked through the window at the party I had paid for and planned and assembled piece by piece, and I thought about 18 years of invisible labor, and something inside me went very, very still. Not broken, not angry. Still. The way a calculation goes still when all the variables have finally been entered and the answer has arrived, and you understand that the answer has been there for a while, and you were simply the last one to look at it. I had not packed that black backpack on the night of the party. I had packed it 2 months earlier. That is the part of the story that matters most, and that is the part I need you to sit with. This was not a reaction. This was a conclusion. I had been assembling the evidence of my own invisibility for months with the same quiet precision I had applied to every other task in that household. And at some point I had understood that the only person who was ever going to act on that evidence was me. The backpack had been sitting in the spare room closet under a shelf of board games that nobody played anymore. Inside I had placed 2 folded shirts, a toiletry kit, and a sealed manila envelope from my attorneys at Bryce, Callaway, and Mills, LLP. The legal work had taken 11 weeks. My attorney, a methodical woman named Patricia, who had been practicing family law for 26 years, had told me that I was one of the most prepared clients she had ever worked with. I had provided documentation of every significant financial contribution I had made to the household over 18 years. Bank records, receipts, the college fund statements, the mortgage refinancing paperwork. 18 years of paper that told a story Carol had apparently never considered would be assembled into a coherent narrative by someone with standing to present it. After the last guest left the party and Carol fell asleep on the couch with the TV still on, I went upstairs and took the backpack down from the shelf. I set it on the kitchen counter beside a torn envelope on which I had written a phone number and a time in my own handwriting. The phone number was Patricia's office line. The time was 9 in the morning. I walked through the house one last time. I ran my hand along the banister I had sanded myself 3 summers ago, the grain smooth under my palm in a way that still gave me a small, quiet satisfaction. I checked the window latch in the dining room, the one I had repaired after the storm in October 2 years back. I stood in the doorway where the pencil marks were still visible, 14 small horizontal lines with dates written beside them in my handwriting, the last one reading Sienna, age 14, 5'4", February. I stood there for a moment. Then I walked out the front door at 4:17 in the morning, and I did not look back once. Carol found the backpack before 8. She came downstairs in the particular distracted way she moved in the mornings, heading for the coffee maker, and she stopped when she saw it sitting on the counter. She knew the backpack. She had seen me carry it years ago. She stood there for a moment and then unzipped it slowly, the way you open something when you already sense you do not want to know what is inside. She pulled out the manila envelope. The seal was intact. She looked at the return address printed in the upper left corner, Bryce, Callaway, and Mills, LLP, and she held it at a slight distance the way you hold something that has just changed temperature. Then she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The first paragraph was an introduction of representation. Standard language. Her eyes moved across it quickly, and I know this because she told me later, word for word, what happened in that kitchen, and she did not spare herself in the telling. By the second line, her hands had begun to shake. Because the second line, beneath the formal introduction, contained the words, petition for dissolution of marriage, and below that, in clear, precise language, the words, financial recovery claim based on documented unilateral contribution. She whispered, no, 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 quietly and repeatedly, as if the words could be reversed by repetition. Then her hands let go, and the letter hit the kitchen tile floor with a flat sound loud enough that Sienna shouted from upstairs, asking what had fallen. Carol did not answer. She grabbed her phone and called me. The call went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. On the third attempt, the line rang once and disconnected, because I had set my phone to accept no calls before 9 in the morning, except from Patricia's office, and I had spent 3 weeks training myself not to flinch when it rang. Carol knelt on the kitchen floor and picked the letter back up and kept reading, her knees against the cold tile, her breath coming in shallow pulls. What she found on the second page was a complete financial accounting of my contributions to the household across 18 years. The mortgage payments during her 11 months of unemployment, the college fund, the party costs, every one of them itemized, including the $3,200 from the previous evening, the mileage, the legal fees for the adoption I had initiated and paid for myself, presented not as grievances but as documented facts, the kind of facts that a family court judge would be asked to weigh against an equitable division of marital assets. What she found on the third page was a letter I had written myself, separate from the legal document, not addressed to Carol, but addressed to Sienna. I had written it over the course of 9 evenings in the spare room with the door closed. It was 4 pages long. It did not contain a single accusation. It contained instead a complete account of what I had chosen to do and why, written in the same voice I had used when I sat on the edge of her bed during fevers, and the same voice I had used when I drove 40 minutes in the rain without asking questions. It began with the pancakes. It described the step stool and the batter on the ceiling and the courtroom and the yellow dress and the judge saying her name with my last name attached to it for the first time. It described every milestone I had kept the record of because I believed the record mattered. It described the party banners and the cake from the specific bakery and the custom photographs, and then it described what I had heard her say, not with anger, but with the plain precision of a man reporting something that had occurred. If he vanished tomorrow, no one would care. I wrote that I was not vanishing. I wrote that I was doing the opposite of vanishing. I wrote that a person who vanishes leaves no record, makes no accounting, offers no explanation, simply disappears into silence and lets the silence be interpreted however is most convenient for the people who remain. I wrote that what I was doing was the opposite of that. I was making myself completely visible, perhaps for the first time. I was presenting 18 years of presence in the form of documentation, because documentation is the language that cannot be talked over or forgotten or revised after the fact. I wrote that I loved her. I wrote that I had loved her from the moment she took my hand and led me to a kitchen to make something neither of us knew how to make, and that love of that kind does not evaporate because the person who holds it is no longer useful or visible or welcome in a room. I wrote that I hoped she would read the letter when she was older, maybe 25, maybe 30, maybe the first time she paid a mortgage or sat in a parking lot waiting for someone she loved without being thanked for it. I wrote that I would be reachable at the number on the envelope, and that I was not asking for anything except to be seen accurately, which was all I had ever wanted. Carol sat on the kitchen floor for a long time after she finished reading. Sienna came downstairs in her pajamas, poured herself cereal, asked where I was, and Carol still could not answer. She just sat there with the letter in her hands, looking at a backpack that had already detonated. It was Sienna who finally reached across the counter, picked up the torn envelope with the phone number and the time on it, and read it. She looked at the clock. It was 8:43. She looked at her mother on the floor. She looked at the phone number in my handwriting. She called me at 8:57. I answered on the second ring. She did not say hello. She said, "Dad." Just that one word. And the way she said it was different from any way she had said it in years. It had weight in it. It had the weight of a word that has been taken for granted and has just been handed back at full value. I said, "Hello, Sienna." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I read your letter." I said, "I know." She said, "The part about the step stool." And she stopped. I waited. She said, "I remember that morning. I remember the batter on the ceiling." I said, "I know you do." She said, "I did not mean what I said last night." And her voice broke on the last word, broke cleanly and completely, like something that had been under pressure for a long time finally releasing. I told her that I believed her. I told her that I also needed her to understand that I could not continue in a version of this family where my presence was treated as irrelevant, where 18 years of showing up was valued at nothing, where being invisible was simply the fee I paid for being allowed to stay. I told her this was not the end of being her father. I told her it was the end of being her father in secret. We talked for 41 minutes. I have not told anyone everything that was said in that conversation, and I do not intend to. Some things belong only to the people inside them, but I will tell you this. By the end of it, she was sitting on the kitchen floor next to her mother with her knees pulled up and her voice quiet and careful, and she asked me one question that I have turned over every day since. She said, "Why did you never just tell me?" I thought about that for a long time before I answered, and then I said, "I think I believed that love was supposed to be obvious without being stated. I think I believed that showing up was its own language and that eventually you would learn to read it." I said, "I was wrong about that. I should have used words much sooner. I should have said out loud, 'I am here. I am choosing to be here. I need you to know that this is a choice I make every day and that choices like this deserve to be acknowledged.'" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I know that now." I did not go back to the house that day, or the next. Carol and I have been in mediation for 4 months. It is not easy. None of this is easy. But easy was never the point. The point was accuracy. The point was a man standing in a room and being seen correctly, for once, not as furniture, not as a source of funding and logistics, but as a person who had made 1,000 deliberate choices in the direction of that family and who had finally decided that invisibility was not humility. It was just a different way of disappearing. I still have the pencil marks on the doorway in my phone. I photographed them before I left. 14 lines, 14 dates. Sienna's height from age 4 to 14, recorded in my handwriting, the last one reading 5'4". I look at that photograph sometimes. I do not look at it with grief. I look at it the way you look at evidence of something that was real, something that happened, something that no amount of distance or silence or a careless comment at a birthday party can revise or erase. It happened. I was there. The marks are still on the wall. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything.